Well, more bad news. Must be a day ending in Y. The United States has deployed, for the first time, a tripwire force to Taiwan in order to get us sucked into a world war when one day China eventually invades Taiwan and reclaims the main island as well as all of the islands under Taiwan's administration. Specifically, these Green Berets have been deployed, and I guess they're being stationed permanently on the island of Kinmen. Although I guess I don't know if it's the main island of Kinmen, because Kinmen County, I guess, has a couple of islands, but they're all right along there. They're right up against China, literally less than 3 miles. I think the closest point I could find was 2.5 miles, and needless to say, this puts American troops, to borrow a phrase from the West, right on China's doorstep. You remember how upset Hillary Clinton was when Russia was moving troops around right on NATO's doorstep, also known as inside of Russia. It was so provocative when Russia was moving Russian soldiers around inside of Russia. How provocative do you think it is when the United States is putting American troops right across the water, a short swim for one of these well-trained soldiers? I bet a Green Beret could swim about 3 miles or 2.5 miles to China from this little island in Taiwan under the cover of darkness. And keep in mind, these are islands that China claims are rightfully theirs. They are theirs and theirs alone, whether we like it or not. That is the official Chinese position. And considering this is now public knowledge that Americans are being stationed on islands that China claims to be a part of not only their sphere of influence, but of their eternal, ancient national territory, this is clearly a slap in the face for Beijing. It is an intolerable insult. And again, we don't have to like that. We don't have to agree with their position, but we have to acknowledge that that is the reality of the situation. And it is very clearly what the U.S. Has in mind here. The Americans have been trying to escalate the situation in Taiwan, essentially provoke a Chinese invasion, for a number of years now. Whereas the past few decades, we've been able to get by with relative peace by just ignoring the problem. Because as I've said in the past, it seemed like the folks in Beijing were perfectly happy to ignore the problem so long as it never bubbled up to the surface. After all, it's not like there is zero cost to invading, seizing, occupying, and enslaving Taiwan. And so as long as Taiwan is not a problem for China, they really have no incentive to go after them. It would be all cost and relatively little benefit. But as Taiwan continues to become more and more overtly anti-China, as they were back in the early days, in the 1950s, under Chiang Kai-shek, well, then the cost of an invasion doesn't look so inordinate compared to the potential benefits. Now, from what I've read, this is the first time that Americans have ever been permanently stationed anywhere in Taiwan, let alone a literal stone's throw away from mainland China. And so, assuming that China is not all talk, and remember, Washington's perspective on this is that China is not all talk, that China is very serious about invading Taiwan, and that that's why we need soldiers there. We need soldiers there to fight, to protect Taiwan. We need to send more and more weapons to Taiwan to literally fight off a full-scale Chinese invasion. And so assuming that that is true and that China is not all talk, this presence of American soldiers, Green Berets, is certainly not going to help shift the tide in favor of Taiwan. This is not shifting the balance of power so that Taiwan is in a substantially better position, so much as it is enraging China and just making the chance of an invasion, or perhaps it's shrinking the horizon. The sun is setting on Taiwan's independence ever more rapidly as a result of these troops being stationed on one of their islands. And yet, it's doing almost nothing to increase their capacity to defend themselves, because after all, Taiwan, very tiny little island, at the end of the day, they're not going to be able to resist a Chinese invasion. They could fight, they could die, but ultimately they will lose. It is the dynamic between Russia and Ukraine times 100. China is infinitely more populous than Taiwan compared to Russia and Ukraine. And it is just an infinitely larger country in terms of resources and mass compared to Taiwan versus, Russia and Ukraine. China invading Taiwan isn't analogous so much as Russia versus Ukraine as it is, let's say, Russia versus Slovakia. Russia versus Ukraine was the largest landmass, or second largest landmass, I guess, because Canada's first, isn't it? Or is that including lakes? I forget who's first. No, Russia is first. Canada's second in terms of landmass. You have the world's largest landmass versus the largest country in Europe, Ukraine. But in the case of China versus Taiwan, you have one of the world's oldest and largest empires. I believe the largest standing army in the world, although North Korea might technically be larger in terms of official numbers, but pretty much I would think China is in reality, they're much more of a real military, the largest military standing army, versus an island of decadent bourgeois tech bros, a country that is just as concerned about a Chinese invasion as they are about ensuring that anatomical males are free to use the women's restroom. I don't say this as an affirmation of China or a condemnation of Taiwan. This is just a statement of facts. If I had my druthers, if we lived in a peaceful world and I had a gun put to my head and I said, and I was told, you're either going to Taiwan or China, pick one, I would pick Taiwan 8 days of the week. But it is just the reality of the world that China is a powerful country and that Taiwan is a weak one. And so ultimately, if there is a dispute between China and Taiwan that comes to a clash of arms, Taiwan will lose. It's not a matter of if, but when. The only way to preserve Taiwan's independence is to ensure that the two countries never come to blows. But if you want to deter a Chinese invasion, the last thing you want is a tripwire force of a handful of American soldiers trampling all over what Beijing considers to be their sovereign territory. Again, how hard is it for an American to imagine, let's say the government of Justin Trudeau, bringing in Chinese soldiers. Obviously, Washington would not let that stand. Whoever was in power would act decisively to ensure that the Chinese did not gain a foothold on America's so-called doorstep. The United States would never permit Chinese troops to be stationed on our border. And so obviously, China, an ascendant, patriotic, and self-respecting country, would certainly not allow that either. So with that said, I hope that one day perhaps we have leaders who come to their senses before it is too late and put an end to this nonsense. So with that said, I will see you folks back here in the next one.